Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we asked and we invited Alexander Auzan, Dean of the Faculty of Economy of the Moscow State University, to share what he thinks about the latest trends and tendencies. You know that Mr. Auzan is one of the founders of the institutional economy in Eurasia. Since 2013, he is being the Dean of the Faculty of Economics in the Moscow State University. And he will speak about the role of institutions. And during one of the conferences, before the COVID-19, we met at our platform. You met with our colleagues speaking about the institutes, and he is also focusing on the social contracts and the public contract, and this is something which we're going to discuss now. And as Mr. Auzan, being the Dean training lots of future economists, let's speak about the human capital, about the role of digitalization, of digital transformation. I think that this is something which our participants will value. Mr. Auzan, actually, our audience is of international nature. Actually, 5,000 people registered for our conference, representing 104 countries. That's excellent. I'm glad to hear you. Thank you so much for your time. Let's speak about the role of the institutions. During COVID-19, you spoke about the big pause or big break, that there will be a different role of the state, a different distribution of the revenues. Let's speak about inclusiveness. After that, we'll speak about the social contract, so to say. But what do you think about the post-COVID reality? And this is high time to revisit the post-Soviet legacy after the countries got their independence and are developing in that reality. And certainly the challenges which we're facing were the impact of quarantine and lockdown, but the drop in the crude prices were accompanied by the change in the trade structure. We see a trade war between the United States and China unfolding. Therefore, it prompts us to make a conclusion that the future for the world would be different. How do you see this future, Mr. Auzan? Let's start with the following. The current crisis is far from being usual. It doesn't look like crisis 2008, 2009, or the crisis of 1997, 1998. It doesn't look like anything we experienced before, because it looks like an external shock. And such crises crises like that take place quite rarely, and they affect not only the economy, they impact our psychology, they change our values, and they change the historical trajectories. Let me draw an example. In the 14th century, a similar pandemic of a similar scale, that was the Black Plague pandemic, resulted in the fact that the whole world changed, Europe changed. Before, there used to be two political leaders prior to the 14th century, China and Byzantine, but after the 14th century, new realities occurred. Actually, Europe was affected by that shock, but it caused different results. In some countries, we saw the emergence of Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, and the current economic success, but part of the countries actually was plunged into the second wave of slavery. That's why it is not the shock which matters, but our reaction to that. At the moment, we see a lot of forks in the road. Look, this crisis is of a civilization nature. What we took proud in the 20th and the 21st century, we were proud of science and scientific achievements. And it turned out that we could not predict and forecast this virus. As a researcher, I may confirm that it is very difficult to predict the emergence of this virus, but it takes us 6 months to deal with that, and we still do not have the treatment. Actually, what other success we had? We extended the human life by more than 30 years, and the education, not every aspect of actually education managed to go online. And Warren Buffett said that crisis is just like the tidal wave. So once the waves go back, you see who was naked, who was swimming naked. The globalization, in essence, is not a consistent process, but it goes in waves. We have 150 or 170 years of statistics. And after the first really global economic crisis of 1857, we may speak about early 20th century, really. We reached the epitome of globalization, but after G20 attempts didn't give any results in terms of globalization, we saw the outflow of globalization. Since 2014, it became more pronounced, and after 2018, it accelerated since the United States announced a war on China. And it was perceived just like the virus attack, and you have to strengthen and consolidate, but still it didn't bring in any consolidation. We are still living amid the outflow of globalization. We'll see more trade blocs emerging, and then it would go back again. So there are two forces. First of all, this is economic integration, and the second factor, which is being studied, which I believe is very important, this is the culture and cultural legacy, social and cultural economies. This is a very exact and very accurate science. We can speak about the profiles of culture, the distance between cultures, and attempts to coordinate different cultures, which may result in the outflow, and the economic gravity would always need such a consolidation. Let us get back to the institutions. The question which you asked about inclusive institutes, and something which we discussed with Jamaat very extensively at Astana Forum, really that's a key question. Because this is since the 14th century that we saw two trajectories, two space speeds. Statistically, they were discovered by Anna Schmatterson, a brilliant British statistician. This is just like two different types of speeds. So everyone is evolving, but some are going at the terrestrial orbit, and others are going into the outer space, going up in the space. The question is actually how deep you may fall during the crisis. So the institutes act as a buffer. If you have certain buffers, then you will evolve in all senses. Germany, for instance, doesn't grow as fast as China, but if we look at the decades, it would turn out that the average growth rate in Germany is much bigger than in China. Because China, after Opium Wars, for more than 100 years, was falling economically. And so at the moment they have some kind of a restorative historical growth. Every country now has a chance to choose a trajectory, to choose it anew, because amid the civilization impact and shock, we may do that. But first of all, actually, there is another factor which has become very pronounced. In the post-COVID situation, we'll see the domination of platforms. Digital platforms are acting as institutions, which actually do not grow from bottom up, and they are not actually growing top-down, but they are growing aside, so to say. Each of these institutions have a multi-million digital population, and they have their own governments acting as aggregators. They have their own markets, ins and outs. They are not affected by antitrust policy, by licensing regulations and standardization. And I think that the level of confidence there is much higher. And the rise in the digital sector in almost all the countries really took place, but according to Forbes, within the months of the quarantine and lockdown, the digital giants increased their revenues by $250 billion. I mean, Amazon and Facebook, but other countries, digital platforms have not become poorer. That's why the first factor is an institutional one. New institutions will get from somewhere fire exit. Are you speaking about inclusive institutes? That's a very difficult question. Because naturally, they do not look like authoritative institutes. So what inclusive institutes and what other institutes are about, not speaking the language of Jamatagli and Robinson. So institutes, this is always about regulations and rules, which forbid something, which allow something, and which will distribute the revenues. And usually this is about getting the rent from natural resources, from monopoly, from administrative connections. These are the extractive institutes. And this is attributable not only to big businesses. SMEs also can get organized the way that they will have some administrative resources that they will somehow distribute the markets, and that's it. But inclusive institutes, they act as transformers. They adapt for people, and therefore they would attract high-quality capital. First of all, this is about taxes. Taxes are being perceived as fiscal phenomena, but taxes, this is also another incentive both for the companies and for the people. And this is a tool. If you may exercise taxes as a tool to improve the competition, then actually the municipalities will compete for this tool. For instance, it might be for instance, income tax, which is being allocated to the religious and educational providers, and part of the income tax can be reallocated to the NGOs. If you are using taxes like that, then the country will become more manageable for you. That's why I think that if we want to respond to the impact of the civilization crisis, very serious taxation reforms have to be implemented once the countries want to get out of the track which is not satisfactory for them. But actually there are countries which are totally satisfied with such a track. For instance, religion, traditions of their ancestors is something which they value very much. But Mr. Jemadaglu in his book saying why some countries are affluent, others are poor, speak a lot about the fact that quite few countries managed to follow the track of sustainable economic growth on the one hand, but on the other hand, he quotes several reasons for that. Lack of inclusive institutes is one of the reasons, one of the causes, something which is not pinpointing the economic growth. But in your research, and your actually main conclusion about the beaten track, you say that some economies hit that beaten track, and it's very difficult to get out of that track once you are there. And, only some global shocks may be very helpful, may be very handy in order to get out of such a track. And you said that this shock probably may help getting out of the track. Let me remind you that we disputed with Jemadaglu about what else is needed for the inclusive growth to get the momentum, to pick up the momentum. I asked Jemadaglu, dear professor, I said, Germany at the time of Weimar Republic was a country of inclusive institutes, both political and economically from your standpoint. But after that, actually, it was not entailed by an economic growth. And he said that this is how the civil society was evolved. And we saw the growth of associations, which was unfortunately accompanied by the support of Nazi Party. And then Jemadaglu said, this is the culture which has to be taken into consideration. So this is what I also think. So this track emerges once we see the merger of culture and institutions. You try to change those formal institutions, but the culture acts as a brake. You are used to certain values. You try to change the culture using some education and other tools, and then the old-style institutions would act as a brake. So usually, you may get out of the track is when you undergo certain long-term, lengthy reforms. Japan, for instance, started its reforms in the middle of the 19th century, but the first results of that actually manifested themselves in 1904-1905, when the Japanese fleet, the Japanese Navy, defeated the Russian Navy. And so it took about 30 years for the first fruits to become obvious, but the economic growth there took even 70 years afterwards. Great reforms of Alexander II actually became obvious or gave some fruits many, many years after his death. In early 20th century, that's why taking out of the beaten track would take many years, and Deng Xiaoping said that will become an average European nation in 40 years, and it was typical of culture, policy, education, and economy. But really, when the economy is hit, when we see some shocks, then we have an opportunity of rapid changes. What the Great Break is about, I actually got that I coined that phrase listening to one of my interlocutors. Several billion people were locked down. What is going on inside their heads, in their brains? We'll understand that serious changes took place. What is going on in the United States and what became a surprise for many people, this is a consequence of this pondering, of this contemplation. So people being locked down thought about the unjust and unfair world we're living in, and so they said, let us plunder, let us loot. And these are the first features of a revolution. So the revolution usually starts from the fact that let us give up and deny all the achievements prior to us. So the history starts from today. So this is one of the consequences. So which way to take? I don't want to go the way the revolutionary impulse prompts us to go. We can speak about social contract, I think. And you differentiate between these notions. We know that post-Soviet economies tried to address the problem of consumer goods and shortage of consumer goods. So this was the main issue for the Soviet Union, and the post-Soviet nations managed to solve this problem, although actually this problem was very much pronounced. So there was some historical development, and following the example of Russia, I think that you do a very good differentiation how the authority, how the society come to an agreement about certain relations. Bear in mind what is going on in Russia. I think that these processes are very interesting. I mean, the amendments to the Constitution, and how do you see the future of these relations? Let me remind our viewers from non-CIS countries, from non-post-Soviet republics, that the USSR was a great country and a very important system. But at the same time, it had a very specific disease. It was a great country which launched satellites and took a man to the space, but it failed to resolve the problem of providing enough food and clothes to its people. It was the so-called shortage economy. If the overproduction economy was typical of the capital society, the shortage economy was typical of socialist economy, of the socialist countries. And this gap had to be closed with the efforts of new states. And this really happened, because the main result of the activity of the post-Soviet republics was not about setting up some dramatically new institutions, but rather addressing of the shortage economy problems. So we made the consumer revolution there, just like the capitalist countries did without any revolution. There was some marriage contract between the authorities and the consumers. And usually this happened in the countries with revenues from oil export. So, for instance, in Russia, the revenues increased 8 to 10% a year, and the consumers said, let you, in return, decide on the political system, on the direct or indirect elections of the governors, etc. So it was a trade-off. So the years were far from being very easy, and then there was some protests, and then the state said, okay, if you don't want the tangible assets any longer, so let us provide you with the intangible values, such as, for instance, superpower. Russia will be a superpower. And the second social contract was signed between the state and the population for 4 years. Until 2018, the real income of people went down and the state support went up. And now we see the third wave of such a social contract between the state and the people. One of the values is the social justice. And it was in January State of Union address made by Mr. Putin, and it was followed by crisis. During the outbreak of the crisis, the authorities made certain mistakes. So we all think that we have allocate to fund about 5 to 6 trillion Russian rubles to the people, and this figure was halved, was ranging from 2 to 3 trillion Russian rubles, and therefore the tension increased. And in May, actually, we saw the implementation of the tax reforms. Before that, extra taxation was introduced in terms of money transfer to the offshore accounts, and after that, another important step was made. The VAT for the physical persons with the income above 5 million rubles was introduced. I think that this was the right step, but actually this increase in the VAT tax had to be used as a political tool, meaning that this 2% incrementally could be voted for in terms of where to invest this money. We believe that this money had to be targeted and that this money would be used for orphan drugs purchase, whereas actually no budget of any person is not enough to buy such orphan drugs. And actually the money which is being paid to the big families, families with big number of children, highlights the U-turn in the social policy. We, the economists, ever since the justice theory was published, when the justice was described, and ever since we have to understand whose position we're strengthening, whose position we're maximizing. Before, the liberal bloc of the government proceeded from the well-known notion of optimality. So it means that actually you may maximize the position of one stakeholder only until you do not deteriorate the position of another stakeholder. So the government said, so let us cut the pie the way not to keep other people hungry. So what we saw in the last 6 months, I think, a lot of people lost their jobs, where SMEs felt a lot of pressure, and you said that more money has to be allocated, including direct transfers to support the basic income. So many countries used such a scheme. Kazakhstan is no exception. And more than 4 million people received such transfers, bearing in mind that we also have some sovereign funds. Please have a look. Before, our economic policy paid a lot of attention to diversification of its economy. So we depend on oil and gas experts, natural resources experts. But how we can create added value other than the oil and gas industry? Russia is a more diversified economy in that sense, but we try to follow the model of Asian tigers, which at a time managed to create an expert-focused, expert-centric models of the economy. And this is about high productivity, and high productivity implies the fact that not so many people are being employed, but rather technologies are being employed. Danny Roderick says that the state has not only to create the expert-focused economy, and now there will be more problems about that. And I do think that such experience cannot be replicated. I mean, the success of South Korea or China, but the state has to create new jobs, and all the governments around the world try to create jobs in order to address the problem of inclusiveness, that the society is more resilient, more sustainable, and more motivated for further development. Therefore, the human capital had to be boosted and social economy has to be boosted. In that respect, what's the future in that sense? And what the governments around the globe have to do in order to somehow reshape its policy, I think that the solutions would be different, because the world suggests several types of social contract. For instance, we look at the world which actually has emerged recently. There are three global propositions, three options. The first is the one offered by China. China actually completed a good digital model and showed how it works, along with some power tools, along with the digital control over everyone, with the capacity to build a COVID hospital within 10 days, to lock down a whole region and undertake some emergency measures. So China shows that this is a very good example. So it showcases its own example. I don't think that it has to be replicated, because such totalitarian models, they always have a very important ideological component. And not very often such an example can be followed. But such a type of a social contract means that a person totally gives up its own features in exchange for the support of entrepreneurship. I do think that China actually lost the very first round of trade war, and China decided to decrease the taxes for entrepreneurs rather than increasing the taxes. So this was an option. So give us all the rights and liberties in exchange for the support of entrepreneurship. So the second example has been showcased by Europe. Germany, Sweden, they did not give up the values of civilization for the 20th century. So they said that justice and freedom is something which we value, so we will run more risks, but will not give up these values. We will follow that option. I think, and frankly speaking, Sweden and Germany coped with responding to COVID-19 because they invested a lot into healthcare. That's a very attractive example, so they said. So this is the social and democratic model. So the healthcare cannot rely on insurance, and insured healthcare actually would be overheated. So this is something which we see in the United States. But the publicly sponsored healthcare proved to be very viable. And social and democratic contract may exist without the support from bottom. The political parties may actually try to get united with other lobbying groups. And the third option is provided by digital platforms, which by nature and by origin are American ones. Although Alibaba, for instance, is from China, still I think that the fray of the giants would be decided at the level of competition between digital platforms. Actually, there are three options. Look, you can give up everything to the state, and many countries gave up everything to the state. And actually, the state decided to exercise digital control, and it looks very nice. So why? Actually, it is very expensive to oversee your own and survey your own citizens. But digital technologies managed to solve that problem. And there is one temptation that you give up everything to the state, the personal data, private data do not exist, and in exchange, the state probably will take care of you. We'll take care of the entrepreneurs, where we'll take care of successful expansion all over the world, or something else. The second option, that's the European example. This is about the consumer market. So if there is a demand from the people for getting back to the values of civilization of 20th, 21st century, then this is an option. So this is a more viable option. So the private data would be protected, etc., etc. Ricardo Hausmann made a speech yesterday, and he said that technologies or technological potential of a country, this is actually the intellectual potential of all the people taken together. And this is his theory about product space, atlases of economic complexity. So everyone is speaking about the importance of human capital. In one of your interviews, you said that it is very important to use the opportunities of such global digital transformation in order to overcome the track effect and to get to a new reality. Where we are lagging behind the most advanced countries, we may catch up because we have a good potential, good academic potential, good educational potential, and therefore we can take advantage of that. As a person who for many years is working in the area of education and science, probably you may tell us that human capital training, this is not only the realm of Ministry of Education and Science, but probably this is up to the whole population. How do we build this system of education? Because it was under shock in terms of online technologies test. What will you advise to the young economists, would-be economists, undergraduates, researchers? What skills would be demanded for in the upcoming 15 years? So let us start with the system of education. I think system of education is in double crisis at the moment. First of all, actually these systems actually are not structured very well, and usually we see the fight between the education system and the natural talents of people. Unfortunately, the system of education gives us a deteriorating selection, especially in the countries where extractive institutions and rent-based economy are in place, because for such an economy, too sophisticated brains are not needed, and therefore we sometimes suffer from the fact that our brilliant students and brilliant engineers are going to other countries. We see the brain drain. I think we have to proceed from the institutions which are interpreted as the market service into something else. As an economist, I may tell you that this is a very strange phenomenon. We see the asymmetry of data, oligopoly, and some specific assets, and simple market mechanism will not work there very well. Therefore, I do think that we have to proceed with a model which I call an investment model. We have to invest into the human capital. We have to look not at what will happen in a quarter, but rather what will happen in 10 years, because investments into the human capital will pay back in 10 years. And you're absolutely right. We have to do that not within the Ministry of Education. Because in order to build it, we have to start with the primary school. We have to join the universities which are competitive, and not all the universities may be competitive, and we have to work with the companies which are clearly competitive, because they are very much interested in having competitive brains to support something. In that triangle, this is where you may build a long-term strategy aimed at investing into the human capital. And thirdly, and this is the answer to the question, what you have to train, is that we are entering the age of artificial intelligence, AI. This is your competitor, my young colleagues. This is not necessarily your partner. And it may affect the professions they follow with. So it will somehow be detrimental to the professions which are based on the algorithms, and lots of professions which are being trained in the universities are based on algorithms, including financial analysts, lawyers, psychologists, etc., etc. So I think that the artificial intelligence may be very detrimental to that professions. So the question arises what we can do. Natural intelligence has a preference. We have several hemispheres. We have intuition, which the artificial intelligence doesn't have, at least as for now. So what we can train, we have to be trained in mathematics, and you know that many scientists actually are famous for their scientific achievements, and another thing is you have to study arts. This is what we have to learn from China and from the Chinese history. Confucius suggested an exam for the bureaucrats, for the officials, where the officials and bureaucrats have to show whether they can write poems and write nicely. So for 300 years, this exam was mandatory, and today's econometric studies show that these are the regions of China which did have such an exam that are more prosperous. Therefore, we will have to reshape the global education system in order to train humanitarian skills. Mathematics, really, and this is something very important because this is the language of the digital economy. I know that you pay a lot of attention not only to the social and cultural research, but I know that you take part in some performances, theater performances, and this is something which you try to bring up in your students. Yes, as a dean and as a member of the Scientific Council of Moscow State University, I certainly realize the importance of these things. It is not that I'm acting as a performer, but really, actually, I wrote a book, and this book was then theatralized, was used in order to write a script for the performance, and my students follow a brilliant trajectory. Our graduates are employed by the best central banks and are employed by foreign universities such as Princeton, Harvard, Milano, Barcelona University, etc. So these are the people who know mathematics very well, and we started bringing up the skills of performing, reading, verses by Shakespeare, etc. And the final question, because we are talking for quite a while, what will you advise to the youth, for the young generation? This is the time of summer vacations, and probably we'll have more time to read something. What books can we read? What we have to understand? What books can you recommend? This question is far from being easy, you know. My relations with the book is as follows. Actually, I select the books very meticulously, but then I take a pencil and I read that very thoroughly, because it's very important to select the book which will impact you very much. But I will not speak about the economics books or philosophy books, social studies books, etc. I would say that when we're living through the disruption, it's very important to read books about history, because you have to look at yourself not through the perspective of 30 or 40 years, but rather to look from the perspective of several centuries, not to miss some turn in the history. It's very important to read a science fiction book, science fiction and fantasy. It's very important to read philosophical books, such as Strugatsky brothers' books. It's not by accident that it is in 1960s that Arkady and Boris Strugatsky became very famous, because 1960s were the years of space discovery, the attempts to see a totally different world. And very often, right now, we are using the phrases and coinages from their books. For instance, we're speaking about the people who wanted something strange. And it is not so important what books you read, but rather how you read that. It is just very important to read something. Thank you so much, Mr. Auzan. Thank you so much for a very interesting interview. I do think that all the topics which we have raised will be discussed in many countries, in many societies. And there were lots of questions which were received about what the governments can do, whether the governments have to spend money. Yes, they do have to spend money. Yes, I know that you answered in every detail in your interview. And we had a very good project, the economic stocks series, when we organize such meetings within the national banks. Physical meetings are now not possible, but I do think that using the AIFC platform, we will arrange for more online discussions. We rely on the fruitful cooperation with economics faculty of Lomonosov University. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Stay healthy. I do hope that Kazakhstan will overcome the difficulties which it undergoes at the moment. And I do hope that we will not be infected, and even under such difficult conditions, we'll have an opportunity to communicate. Thank you so much. Thank you. And see you again. Thank you.